dragon legends could actually be stories about what we today call dinosaurs.
People would say that the dragon legends of old are obviously not true, but it's only obvious because of their preconception that dinosaurs died out so long ago.
But when you have this universal theme right across the globe, many different continents, many different cultures, and over a vast span of human history, then there's probably going to have to be some universal core truth there.
Dinosaurs are probably used more than anything to convince people of millions of years. I mean, even little kids all know about dinosaurs.
Just say the word dinosaurs and see what they say next. They probably would say evolution. Those two concepts are inextricably linked.
The most common objections they encounter is that the Bible can't be true because science has disproved it. You ask them what that means, they mean evolution millions of years.
If the soft tissue means what it apparently means, and that is that dinosaurs were around recently. There was no dinosaur age where only dinosaurs lived and millions of years ago. Once you topple millions of years, you have no time for evolution.
The more you study about dinosaurs, they really fit with creation. And the evidence seems to go with humans encountering dinosaurs, and not very long ago.
Creatures like this were supposed to be separated by mankind for 65 to 70 million years. Yet, here we have respectable people writing in their history books, this is what I've seen, this is what I've witnessed.
It's a good story.
You know someone's going to say something.
Like what? Got something against Danny?
Oh, don't play dumb, you know what I mean.
Still gonna read it.
It's on you then, nothing to do with me.
Fine. Okay, kids, come on over, gather round. We're gonna have story time. Come on, find a seat on the carpet. Can everybody see? Yeah? Okay, good. Okay, guys, today's story is called Danny the Dragon.
Thank you all for coming. Please note that the opinions expressed during the story time are those of the author and do not necessarily represent those of the Monroe Library or its staff.
Thanks, Tony. Would you like me to have them sign release forms? Once upon a time, not too long ago, there was a dragon named Danny. He lived in a deep, isolated cave along an ocean coast. One day, he wandered out of the water and saw some houses and people. Curious, he lumbered closer for a better look.
Dragons, just the word conjures up all these images, and people's attention goes right to the dragons. People want to know about dragons.
Dragon legend is absolutely a phenomenon. There are literally too many legends to count. They're in every tribe and nation, every people group, and you have them in China, Australia, Africa, Europe, North America, and South America, everywhere people inhabit.
Dragons are really interesting creatures. I think there's not a child with soul so dead that he hasn't become fascinated by dragon stories and dragon legends. And the thing that's always struck me as amazing is that it's not a regional legend. It's not a legend of the Chinese but nobody else, or a legend of the Europeans and nobody else. It's everybody's legend.
Now, a legend is, of course, a legend. It's a fairy tale. But is there, in fact, most anthropologists will tell you that whenever you have a legend or mythology, that there's usually something that happened that started that myth.
So the point is there is some consistent threads in these different cultures, South Sea Islands, South Pacific, American Indians, so forth. So when you find the similar kinds of legends that suggest that either a common legend exchange or those legends deriving from some kind of historical antecedent.
If we're to believe that they're mythological, that really presents a logical problem for us because there is a consistency that happens throughout all the dragon legends. Of course, dragon legends can become sensational. You know, a lot of your pagan religions attach some sort of meaning to these things. Like a lot of times in Chinese mythology, a dragon would, be responsible for the tides, or it would control the water, or something like that. But if you scrape away all the sensationalism, you actually have a very real creature at the bottom of it, and that is consistent throughout really the entire world. You just have a large, scaled reptile that has many of them fly, some of them don't, but the ones that do fly have wings like a bat. and they're carnivorous, and they're basically going to gnaw your face off. And it is consistent no matter where you go, and that truly is remarkable.
They look like big reptiles with long tails, with scales, with sharp teeth, claws, oftentimes 3 claws, by the way, which many of the dinosaurs did have 3 claws, like theropods. So I believe they're what many people have called dragons, or have been translated to the word dragon, really reflect a human experience, widespread among almost all cultures, of having witnessed at some point in history very, very large, very frightening reptiles.
You know, the dragon legends, the stories of these dragons, they always talk about these huge reptilian beasts with fierce teeth and prickly spines, and they just sound so much like dinosaurs.
It's like knowing about Julius Caesar or Alexander the Great. We had to rely on historical records of these things, because you can't scientifically prove that Julius Caesar existed. It's always a matter of history. I think dragons, a lot of that will be widespread historical writings of such creatures, including, for instance, the Chinese calendar, where you had 12 animals. One of them is a dragon. I was born on the year of a dragon, but all the animals are treated as equally real. So it does seem like the Chinese people did see a creature we would now call a dragon, which they call the long.
Actually, there are a lot of legends of dragons being used for breeding. The Chinese have stories about breeding dragons. There are artifacts that show people riding these things.
It's quite remarkable that, to many people, that Australian Aboriginal people actually have accounts of their ancestors having encountered creatures that today, by any reckoning, you'd describe as being dinosaurs on the basis of scientists' reconstruction from fossils. On a personal level, I recall meeting a university researcher in the Northern Territory in Darwin after giving a presentation there a couple of years ago, and she said that she'd been working with the local Larrakia Aboriginal people, and they had a word for a fierce creature that lived in the local swamps there that used to terrorise the first Aboriginal people who come to that area via canoes from another country far away. And when this university researcher said to them, "Oh, that word obviously means crocodile," the Larrakia people responded, "No, we've got a different word for crocodile. This other creature, in fact, looks very similar to some of your dinosaurs in your children's book about dinosaurs."
There is an Indian legend called the Thunderbirds. And according to legend, these huge bird-like creatures would fly, and they would actually be able to bring thunder with them. And at first that seems sensational. But if you start looking at the evidence, things change just a little bit. Because what is in the Black Hills in South Dakota, the legend is that these giant thunderbirds would actually fly to the top of the Black Hills, and they would like nest there. Now what is fascinating is that scientists had long believed that those kind of gigantic creatures needed strong winds to propel them to high heights. And so in the west, where you have these gigantic thunderstorms, it is really postulated these gigantic pteranodons would catch thermal updrafts of these storms that would lift them to the top of places like the Black Hills. So from an Indian's perspective, that is trying to pull meaning from the things in nature, they would look at these, what they would call thunderbirds, and go, wow, they are bringing thunder. But it's actually, what's really happening is that it's the thunderstorms that are actually bringing the pteranodons.
This is taken from a book named After the Flood, where he recounts, dinosaurs in the form of flying reptiles were a feature of Welsh life until surprisingly recent times. As late as the beginning of the present century, elderly folk at Penllyn in Glamorgan used to tell of a colony of winged serpents that lived in the woods around Penllyn Castle. As Mary Trevelyan tells us, the woods around Penllyn Castle, Glamorgan, had the reputation of being frequented by winged serpents, and these were the terror of old and young alike. An aged inhabitant of Penllyn, who died a few years ago, said that in his boyhood the winged serpents were described as very beautiful. He said it was no old story invented to frighten children, but a real fact. His father and uncle had killed some of them, for they were as bad as foxes for poultry. The old man attributed the extinction of the winged serpents to the fact that they were terrors in the farmyards and coverts. This is a pteranodon, an example of one. And by the way, not all of them were huge, with big long wings. And in Beowulf, it describes two different kinds. One which had massive, huge wings, which we know existed from fossils, 30 foot and more wingspan. But there's another kind of winged serpent that was smaller, but it was just as much a pest, not just in Beowulf, but in England and to the North American Indians and Central American Indians, etc.
Interestingly, there's a Scandinavian king called Beowulf, and there's a very famous poem about his exploits. And if you read about his description of this big beast that he killed because it was terrorizing the villagers, it's a very accurate description of a Tyrannosaurus rex.
Most people say Beowulf is entirely mythical because there's all these monsters in it. But if you read Beowulf, the poem, it doesn't say fairies and magic elves. It's talking about the Grendel. It's talking about a bipedal monster with giant mouth and big teeth that ate people, just like we might imagine a pteropod dinosaur might do.
In the Gat National Park in Nebraska, there are these structures in the side of the rocks called Devil's Corkscrews. And for years, scientists thought that the plants, or some sort of plant, created these spiral structures that descend from the surface down about 6 feet. But it was not until they started excavating them that they found these little fossils of beavers at the bottom of them, and they found out that these beavers made these wild corkscrew lodges in the rock. And evolutionary timelines would put this beaver to be extinct about 30 million years ago. But the problem with that is that American Indians know full well what those corkscrews were. And if you would have asked a Lakota Indian, they would have told you they were beaver lodges.
My point with Haas Eagle is, the Maoris tell a legend about a giant eagle. And it's easy for us to say, oh, giant eagle, whatever. But it's been verified, and it's published. It's the real deal. It was a giant eagle. So if they were right about the giant eagle, then perhaps peoples have been telling the truth in their legends of other creatures too.
Most people today accept that dinosaurs have become extinct, and even creationists who look at the accounts of apparent recent human dinosaurial contact would say, look, it does seem that dinosaurs are extinct. However, there are some tantalizing accounts of sightings in very recent decades from various places around the world. In the Congo, for example, the local people there talk of a creature they call Mokele Mbembe. And when Westerners have gone in with drawings of African creatures and dinosaur handbooks, and they've pointed to pictures of, say, the hippopotamus or the rhino, the people have said, no, that's not Mokele Mbembe. And when shown a picture of a sauropod dinosaur in a dinosaur handbook, they've pointed to something like a small sauropod dinosaur. Another example comes to mind, the Lake Murray region of Papua New Guinea. There were people there out in a canoe, and as they looked under their canoe, they saw a large creature swim under the canoe that had what looked like triangular plates extending down its back and all the way down its long tail. And the people speak there of large nesting sites adjacent to the water's edge, which have been clearly left by a large creature.
If you only had one or two stories that sounded a bit similar to dinosaurs, you could see it as just a coincidence. But when you have this universal theme right across the globe, many different continents, many different cultures, and over a vast span of human history, then there's probably going to have to be some universal core truth there. In fact, the late Dr. Carl Sagan, one of the most well-known of all the world's evolutionists, took it so seriously that he actually wrote a book called The Dragons of Eden to try and answer this question as to how come there are so many different stories of dragons that are very similar to the dinosaurs when no one's ever seen a dinosaur. And the answer he came up with in his book was essentially that, well, we evolved from reptiles, so part of our brain is a sort of a leftover of when we lived in the age of the reptiles, and so dragon legends are really, if you like, inherited memories from the age of reptiles. Now, there was an embarrassed silence from many of his evolutionary colleagues because, of course, there's no scientific credibility to the idea that memories are inherited. You know, that you might remember what some ancestor did when he was serving Cleopatra or something like that. But the importance of that little account was that one of the world's leading evolutionists took this issue so seriously that he tried to explain it, even though he didn't do a very good job. A much better explanation is that the Bible is right, that man and dinosaur did live together, and what we see are the somewhat corrupted legends, somewhat corrupted stories of a time when people and dinosaurs did really know each other.
Some people saw Danny coming. He was huge with scales and a long tail. They ran away screaming, "Dragon, dragon, run for your lives!" Danny yelled, "Come back!" But it just sounded like, "Roar!" This made everyone run faster. Stories about Danny's huge teeth and claws soon spread across the land.
If these really are stories based on memory, that means that at one point in time, man did see dinosaurs.
In National Bridges National Monument, Utah, there's actually some carvings, petroglyphs, done by the Indians that even an evolutionist in an evolutionary textbook says looks like a sauropod dinosaur. And we've actually had a team go out there, they've seen it, photographed it, did a wax cloth impression of it, and it just looks like a sauropod dinosaur. But of course the evolutionists would say, well no, it must be some mythical animal. Why? Because dinosaurs didn't live with people. Well, how do you know that? And so to me, that sort of evidence, when you look at your dragon legends, many of the descriptions of those dragons actually fit nicely what we would call dinosaurs. And many of your dragon carvings, for instance, that you see, dragon paintings around the world, they look like some of the dinosaurs that we would understand existed from the fossil record.
The exact date was 1186 AD. And it's a stone temple that's in the Angkor Wat temple complex around Cambodia. And in the jungle area,
there's a number of stone carvings of things that are familiar to us today, along with Hindu and Buddhist mythology. And very distinctively, there's one that looks very much like a stegosaur, as reconstructed from fossils by scientists. And the question becomes, how did the people who carved that stone 800 years ago have carved so beautifully a stegosaur without having had any knowledge about what's in today's encyclopedias? And the clear conclusion is they were familiar with those creatures because they were alive at the same time.
Unless it was living, how could they get its anatomy correct? They had to see it in order to reproduce it correctly. And that's just one of over 80 instances around the world, in every single continent, where it's been found that humans and dinosaurs have coexisted because the humans have reproduced dinosaurs in one art form or another.
There's a cathedral in the UK, Carlisle Cathedral, which has been there a very long time. And one of the bishops buried there 600 years ago has, on the brass trimmings around his tomb, a number of engravings of animals, many of which are familiar to us today, but there's also some that look very much like sauropod dinosaurs. In fact, any 21st century child would immediately recognize them as being sauropod dinosaurs. And so when we think about the evolutionary view that says dinosaurs became extinct 65 million years ago, and then we look at these sauropod dinosaur engravings on this 600-year-old tomb, how did they get there?
The oldest artifact that we have, period, is an Egyptian slate that commemorates an Egyptian king. And Hierakonpolis slate is one of the names given to this artifact. And on one side it shows him grasping the head of his recently defeated foe and about to chop the head off. So it's a slate saying, look how great I am. And on the back, it's got some Egyptians with ropes around necks of two great sauropods looking, I mean, they look just like a children's book with a Apatosaurus on it or something, necks intertwined. And we have this motif repeated on two different, totally different places, separated by hundreds of years.
Obviously, if there are engravings of sauropod dinosaurs which are hundreds of years old, prior to any scientists' reconstructions of fossils, the only way that we could say that they could have done it so intelligently was if they had viewed the creatures for themselves, or at least had access to sketches or drawings or descriptions made by eyewitnesses of those creatures at around that time.
As some people look at the fossil record, as some people look at evidence that humans and dinosaurs lived at the same time, they see pictures, they see drawings, they see carvings, they see work in metal and weaving of individuals that have actually reproduced dinosaurs. And the American Indian is one of those groups that has done that, especially in paintings and drawings.
Adrienne Mayer, first of all, if we talk about what she's done on this, I think we ought to give her credit for doing a tremendous amount of research. And when I say data, I mean legend after legend after legend after legend of descriptions of the same kinds of creatures that were giant, terrible lizards. There were thunderbirds. There were water monsters given the same description from tribe after tribe after tribe across North America, but even in South America and Central America. We've got this robust, legendary lore, complete with descriptions of habitat, descriptions of habit, anatomical attributes. Where did all this come from?
And some people say, well, we don't want to have the Indian living at the dinosaur, so the Indian went ahead and found bones, and then went ahead and assembled those bones into the proper shape, and then put the musculature and the skin on the bones, and then based upon what they came up with, they then did a drawing showing what this dinosaur or reptile would look like in life. Now, with all due respect to the skills of the American Indian, and there are a great many of them, I honestly don't know if paleontology hundreds of years ago was one of them.
Well, the very fact that we have these artifacts begs the question, how did they know to draw these? In other words, if they're mythological, how is it that they all drew the same exact myth, and yet they're separated through distant time as well as distant geography? And the question, it's a tough one to answer because it depends on your worldview. And if you back up and think, if I just go based on the data, then it seems to suggest on its surface that these people, real life people, at some point encountered creatures that looked like this.
I've been informed that in a cave in France there's a mammoth seemingly engaged with or in combat with a dinosaur. Now, if that's so, that's very significant, because even though mammoths are extinct, everybody accepts that mammoths and humans live together, because you sometimes find spear points of human spears in mammoth fossils or mammoth skeletal remains in caves. And of course there are many drawings of mammoths by people, and everybody agrees they're mammoths. So if mammoths and humans are together, and you see a picture of a mammoth and a dinosaur together, then obviously dinosaurs and humans were together too, which of course evolutionists say is impossible.
American Indians had this legend. They called this creature the grandfather of the buffalo. And, that's an interesting description, because you're like, okay, what would a grandfather buffalo look like? Obviously it would have long hair, it would look like a buffalo, but they said it was much, much, much bigger. Well, there was a waterfall found in Minneapolis, and underneath this waterfall was this tusks of a mammoth. And Indians actually pointed to that spot and said that's where the grandfather of the buffalo lived. And what's fascinating is if they were able to understand the flesh, they were understand the hairy characteristics of this mammoth, there's only one way they could have known that, is if they would have actually seen the creature.
And once again we see that the evolutionary time frame, that the layers in the rocks represent millions of years, comes to grief on things like this, which show that people, dinosaurs and mammoths and many creatures that we're familiar with today all lived at the same time.
First of all, what we have to understand now, it was not until the year 1822 when Gideon Mantle and his wife found the iguanodon tooth. And that was supposedly the absolute beginning of our understanding of dinosaurs. And the modern academia will tell you that is when we discovered them. Well, the problem with that is that we have all these images of ancient people groups that had intimate knowledge of dinosaurs. They drew them on vases, they were on pottery, and if it is true that they had no knowledge of dinosaurs, then where in the world did all those images come from?
The people went to the police and demanded that something be done. The police gathered their weapons and their bravest officers and went off to see what they could find. Danny was terrified. He just wanted to find a friend. He was very old and had looked everywhere but couldn't find anyone else like him. It was like he was the last dragon on Earth.
You know, it's funny how historians treat ancient history. Because we've got a lot of ancient historians writing things that we take today as matter of fact. Like, you know, this event happened, okay. But then when they start talking about some other things that they believe were true, historians will just discount it. Like, you know, Marco Polo's writing about dragons. Alexander the Great is talking about his giant lizard that frightened his army. And there's all sorts of other accounts in history as matter-of-fact accounts of great lizard-like beasts, and yet they're routinely discredited as not being true.
You know, it is a misnomer that some of these dragon legends, or all the dragon legends, are just a product of opium-inspired pagan religions. I mean, that is not the case at all. What you have is you have actual historians. You have Herodotus, you have Flavius Josephus, you have Marco Polo that talk about dragons. Herodotus actually heard an account of flying reptiles, and he went and checked it out himself. And so, I mean, he showed the mettle of a true historian. 400 years later or so, you have Flavius Josephus, an incredible Jewish historian, also talking about seemingly the same creature. You have this flying reptile. You have Marco Polo that after his journey to China is describing a huge dragon. He calls it a dragon with this tail that is really dragging through the sand, leaving these marks. And we come to the point where we have to ask ourselves, are all these people just making this up? They are describing creatures that were not supposed to be alive then. According to evolutionary theory, that creatures like this were supposed to be separated by mankind for 65 to 70 million years. Yet, here we have respectable people writing in their history books, this is what I've seen, this is what I've witnessed. And they sound just like dinosaurs.
Well, I think we should take the testimony of these very reliable historians for the most part. I think that they were very candid in what they were writing about when it came to historical narrative. And if they were talking about these large, formidable creatures, I don't see why there's any reason to question that.
If man and dinosaurs never lived together but were separated by millions of years, then we have to say all those ancients were mistaken. And I don't believe that we should accuse them of that because they were intelligent people like you and I. They built cities before the flood. We're told that they had musical instruments. They had tools of iron and brass. Now you think about that. Before the flood they had metal tools. That implies they had to find the metals, they had to mine them, and they had to smelt them exactly like we do today. So let us not dare accuse ancient people of being unintelligent and untechnological.
The Bible does use the term dragons over and over again. It talks about ocean dragons, it talks about flying dragons, it talks about land dragons. And, you know, that seems to fit with these great reptilian beasts, including dinosaurs. It makes sense. If those things were so dominant on the planet before the flood and certainly right after the flood, they would have made it into the history of the culture.
In 1845, a newspaper in the town of Geelong in Victoria published a sketch of a creature that the local Aboriginal people had described as a bunyip.
Common Aboriginal term for monster. It's often thought of as mythical, but this Aboriginal had big, deep claw marks across his chest, and the description he gave, presumably through an interpreter at the time, was the basis of this sketch in the Geelong Advertiser, and it looks very much like one of the duck-billed dinosaurs. In fact, some large bones were reported at that time that were fresh and were unlike any other creature that people were familiar with at the time.
And 13 years later, on the other side of the world, a dinosaur was unearthed, and it was called Edmontosaurus. And when you look at a reconstruction of Edmontosaurus next to the sketch of the bunyip drawn by the artist for the newspaper in Geelong on the basis of Aboriginal descriptions, the two are very similar.
You have to interpret evidence of the present in relation to the past. And what I would say is this: there is very strong circumstantial evidence, because all evidence in relation to the past is like a forensic scientist. They're working with circumstantial evidence. Is very strongly confirms the Bible's history that dinosaurs and people lived at the same time.
With so many people hunting him, Danny had to hide. As he rumbled back toward the ocean, he passed a man with 2 daughters walking along the beach. Instead of running, They just stopped and stared in shock. Danny said, "Hello, how are you?" which sounded like a ferocious